Yeah, it seemed to be a guide little. Let me just close the browser and restart it.
Simon, do you want me to share?
Yeah, can you please? Because it seems to be not coming up.
Okay, 1 minute.
Yeah.
Okay, let's take a quick look. Components, model catalog, definition types, starter type, node type. Let's look at resource resolution. So resource resolution, okay, inside of it, yes, we do have inputs. And we do have outputs here. Okay, so sorry about that. So, Sarah, when we display that interface section, then the way we want to display it is in this format.
This is one other thing that confused me. What is the difference between the attributes and the interfaces inside the node or the function description and the one we have in the JSON file for the package?
In the definition file?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's pretty much a copy. So this, what we have is a model, right? It's not like it may, some things are required that will be used and certain things may be optional. But if you look here, let's look at, so when you define a workflow, you define the input and output that you want to return back. You know, it's a custom type of input and output that you may return back to your client. Each workflow accesses a function attribute. That function attribute is part of the component definition. So if you can see here for this, let's say, resource resolution component, we are just defining input of resource resolution summary and artifact prefix. And that's it. We don't define anything else as part of this for this specific resource assignment component action.
Okay. For the template prefix, where did I get it?
Template prefix is coming from the workflow input. If you see here, give me 1 second. Okay, sorry about that. If you take a look at the workflow definition, the template prefix is being defined as input. So let's take a quick look. You can see here, input, this is template prefix. Okay, and this input is, we're gonna do a get on this input, and we're gonna say this input is gonna be passed to this specific component that is part of resource resolution.
Okay.
So remember, Sarah, when we talked about it last time, we said whenever we define artifacts, we can say get input of the template prefix or it's going to be a list of the artifacts that we are defining here, right? So those are the two options we will have. But coming back to this point, the resource resolution component is just using the resolution summary and artifact prefix as the only two inputs. It's in here, okay? And then the other thing I want to say, in the output section of the workflow attribute, you can see in the output, let me show you 1 second. The output, we have the resource, let me see, where is the output? Here we go. We're defining a custom output, and in this custom output, we're saying that we want to get the resource assignment and assignment params, which is also defined as part of the component. So you can see that here. 1 second. Definition type, started type, node type, and resource resolution. You see here the get attributes. It has an attribute definition of assignment params. So that is defined as part of getting the attributes itself.
But you are talking about the action itself, the configuration of this action. I think that we are setting these attributes first, and then we can add the function next. But I see that there is a relationship between the setting and the configuration here and the function. Actually, I cannot relate between them now. That's what's confused me.
So the get attributes, the way it works is that it can get any of the attributes defined within your component. Okay? So as part of output or input, when the user types in get attributes, he can say that he wants to get the attributes of assignment params or assignment map.
Okay, so the attributes of the action are from the node types we provided on the import tab from the configuration package configuration.
From the component itself.
Yes.
And then the get input is any workflow input. So when the user types in get input, right, we want to tell them here are your input options, and the input options are whatever we define in the workflow inputs or action inputs are. Okay, because the point is we want to make this as seamless as possible to the user. So when we type in get input, it should say get input of what? Get input of the inputs defined in your input workflow, right? Or action workflow. When the user types in get attributes, he will basically have a way to say here are the attributes that are supported. And here we support assignment params and assignment map for the get attribute definition. Let me see, is there anything else? I think resource versus all of these other stuff. So Sarah, all these other things are like optional within input. So I don't know how we want to display it. Do you want to display it in a way where the user clicks on the plus and says here the here are the things we want to support it as part of that component?
I will let them all, and I think that you have the user can select one or many elements from these inputs, right?
Yes.
So my idea was to provide a search input and a list, and user can choose between to search by name or maybe if checking and selecting from the list. Right.
If you can select from the list and say here are the inputs I want, I think that may be good. We can just render that. Yeah. Those as options.
And of course,
and by default. By default, you just want to, if it's if required is true, just display it automatically. And if something is required as false and the user wants to enable it, then he can click on the plus and enable that as input.
Okay. Okay, 1 second. I thought that these are a default values that user cannot edit or modify. So by selecting,
default.
I mean that by selecting these, I thought that we only select the what are you calling these? I'm sorry, inside the inputs.
This is inside the
The
component.
one, the resource key, the resolution key or occurrence.
Yeah,
What are you
these
calling
are
it?
attributes, right?
Okay,
Component
so the
attributes.
attributes. I mean that the user will select the attributes he wanted, but I thought that he just pointing to them just to bring them, but without any editing.
Oh, no, no. When he selects those options, those attributes, if it's a type of string, then we want to display a string, a text box, right? If it's a Boolean, then you want to display true or false. So if it's integer, you want to display a text box and allow it to enter an integer value
we are
or
showing
whatever the default are.
the
The
details,
default is.
but it will be editable.
It will be editable. The user should be allowed. For example, if occurrence by default we set it to 1, the user may change it to 2 or 3 of the number of occurrences. If he provides a resolution key, then he has to provide some input because right now resolution key is not set to anything. So the user may say get input of of host name or some ID, right, for the resolution key. So this will be something that the user will populate. It's basically an attribute. The component attributes is a form that the user would populate.
So I think it's the same idea like the template mapping that we are bringing some attribute and user can modify the default settings.
Yes, it's very similar idea. But he's doing that to define the component definition itself. But not all of this is required. So like for example, why is request ID true? I guess request ID is required, yes. Like for example, resource ID is false and action name is false. So some of these are optional, right? We want to, if these things are optional, I was thinking that if you click on that plus sign, you can enable those as required, and if you enable that as required, it'll be required for that specific component, for that specific instance of the component. Otherwise, if it's optional, you don't display it. You only want to display things that are required by default, like action prefix or request ID.
So when do we display the optional attributes then?
If you click on that plus sign, and the user will say, yes, I want this attribute to be populated, right? Or it's required. And then once he selects that specific thing, submits that, then we render the form to include that specific attribute and allow the user to enter the value for that attribute.
So initially, we display only the required attributes, and then the user have the option to add the optional attributes.
Right. That's what I was thinking. Sarah, I don't know, from a design, do you think that's worthwhile to do? That we limit the user to only first initially see what are the required parameters, and then if he wants additional parameters to utilize additional parameters within this component, he clicks on the plus and then selects here the additional parameters I want for this instance of this component. Sorry, you're on mute.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
thinking.
yeah. Just it's getting confusing, but I don't know. That's why I wanted to get back to the meaning of the recording video. So
Okay. So the main idea is that each component has required and optional fields. The question becomes when the user drags and drop a component, right?
Yeah.
In the component attributes, you want to display to him only the required fields. Those are must-haves that the user can populate their or fill in their values if necessary, or display the default, whatever that may be. If the user wants to access additional attributes of that component, then he can click on that interface plus sign and select the additional attributes, which will be rendered in that form, and we can let the user fill in those additional attributes.
So
The
the
one thing I want
interface.
to avoid is displaying everything to the user at once. It might confuse them. I rather limit it to what is required and then allow him to access additional uh, parameters as part of his component modeling for that specific instance.
What would we show him all, even all the required elements?
Can you repeat that again?
Why would we show the required elements of this component?
The required element is always needs to be populated. It's a must, right? So it's something that the users always need to populate, right? Or in some case fill in, like
Like
request
what?
ID or artifact prefix, right? These things are required in this specific component. So he wants to, if he, for example, for artifact prefix, he's going to define the resolution of this by either get input or by saying I want to, select from the template store the following components, base config or whatever other components defined for that CBA.
So that means that for each optional component, that optional attribute the user selected, we need a delete button for in case the user don't want to use that attribute anymore.
Yes, we can have a delete button for that attribute.
Will be only for the optional attributes.
Right.
Is this clearer, or should we run through the use case again?
I think I'll get back to the recording.
Okay. All right. If anything, Sarah or Simon, if you want to additionally discuss, just let me know. We can set up a follow-up tomorrow or the day after.
Yeah. Like Sarah said, I would go back to the recording and take it once more first. Yeah.
Okay, so now that from I stand corrected. The component also defined input and output. I thought initially that only workflow had to be had, but it looks like components have it too. So that means, Sarah, that in our display we want to display an input interface and input, right? And for the input and output, you want to display the different attributes that are required or optional.
Okay.
So in that case, then for interface, we still have that plus button, or we don't need to do that?
I think you would still want it for the case where we want to say here are the optional attributes we want to render in the component attribute screen.
I think I'll need to move it to another place that can define if. I think we may not have it every time. Maybe all the attributes are required, so we won't have to add another option. There will not be any other options. So it depends on the components and the attributes.
Okay.
So I think I'll need to move it to another place related to the attributes, and give it a that it only appears when there are other optional attributes we can include.
Okay. Okay, yeah, I looked at the script executor as well. It also has the input definition, and it has script type as required, and script class reference as required, and dynamic properties is optional. So if the user wants to use dynamic properties, he should enable it and then fill out that specific form to use it. Okay. Any other questions on this? Simon, do we have anything else for Sarah?
Just one more question though, and one more button. Is the pencil button? What would that?
Can you share that screen?
To share the screen. Yeah, because it didn't. Okay, let me see.
That was for the editing, but I think we won't need it anymore.
Oh, okay. So no need for the pencil button. Okay.
Yeah. The other button you mentioned, the delete button, I think in that case, it will only appear next to the optional attributes.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Okay. So Sarah, when you done with the update, is it going to be in InVision.com? Like
Yeah,
update
yeah.
this box? Okay.
Yeah. Once I'm done with it, I'm uploading, or maybe I'll send you that it is updated to review.
Okay. Okay, so yeah, Yuri, that's all the questions I have for Sarah.
Okay. All right. Very good. So let's, Sarah, if there's additional feedback you have, maybe we can stick out this week or next week to go over it. Just let us know.
One update. Actually, we're having today the orange demo that we're talking
Right.
about. That we may have another wizard from the package creation.
Can you say that again?
That we may add another wizard for to create to guide the user how to create a package.
Okay.
That's one other thing that I think I will need to cover.
And Sarah, do you know when you think you will have these updates in InVision?
I think I can give you an answer or estimation time after I review the recorded video. Because I see some elements that I cannot connect. I cannot connect between them, so I'll get back to the video to make sure that I got all the points together, and if I have if I'm okay, I can send you estimation time next.
Okay, fair. Yeah.
Hello?
Yeah, I'm done here. Thanks.
All right. So what I'll do, I'll send out the recording as soon as it's available. Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Sarah, for joining us. Thanks, Simon.
Thank you.